Say, and nobody out here is going to want slavery. The Native Mexicans who live out here, they're against it. There aren't going to be enough Southerners moving out into this territory to let slavery gain a foothold in this region. It's not going to happen. But when they talk to the South, they tell a very different story. They say, you know what? Popular sovereignty is going to protect your rights. It is going to protect the rights of the slaveholders because it is going to allow this constitutional mechanism that basically involves letting the people draft a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery constitution. It's going to allow this to work. And only when they are prepared to draft a constitution may the people in these territories determine whether they will be slave or free. Now, when you first take a look at that, it seems like such a hair-splitting distinction. You know, well, why does it matter? Why does it matter if the people out here don't get to vote on the slavery issue, you know, until they draft a constitution? Or why does it matter that they would get to vote immediately? It makes a huge difference, and people in the South recognize it, because there aren't any Southerners who live out here. If the people in New Mexico and Utah are allowed to vote on the slavery issue almost immediately after they're created as territories, these places are going to become anti-slavery. They're going to become free territories and will become free states. But if you can delay that decision, if you can say, okay, time out, you can't make this decision. It's against the Constitution to make it until there's enough people out in this territory to compose a state and until they can draft a constitution. Well, then that's different. Maybe enough Southerners will be able to move out here by then, and maybe then these territories will become slave territories. So it's a crucial distinction. And those Northern Democrats that I keep coming back to, they knew it was a crucial distinction, and they knew to avoid it because they were trying to build a compromise platform. They're trying to get North and South to come together. The only problem is that they can't, because increasingly this issue over slavery and the extension of slavery into the West is producing irreconcilable differences between the North and the South. So they even come up, and this is really beautiful how they do this, they come up with another way. They say, well, we've got to finesse this even more because people in the North and the South start to realize the game, the dangerous game that these politicians are playing. They say, you know, we've got to come up with a way to finesse this. And they say, well, all of this is subject to what they call, quote, the general principles of the Constitution. Okay, well, that one really threw me. And as I start reading into stuff, it becomes very clear that these proponents of popular sovereignty now realize that the idea will not work because the North and South can't agree on who's sovereign and when they're sovereign and why they're sovereign. And so now they're saying, well, this all has to be subject to the principles of the Constitution. Who decides the principles of the Constitution? Who's the ultimate judge of that? The Supreme Court. So now not only Congress is saying, well, we can't solve it, the people can't solve it, maybe the Supreme Court can solve it. This all comes up again in 1854 in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Good old Kansas will be the catalyst for all of these issues really coming to a head. And they'll try popular sovereignty in Kansas, and that Kansas will prove that the idea is essentially a fraud. That the Missourians who flood this border and try to vote for slavery in Kansas have one objective in mind, and the Free State Kansans who are within this territory have a whole other objective in mind. And so when Stephen Douglas proposes popular sovereignty in Kansas Territory, things change yet again. And you see, that's when Bleeding Kansas ensues, and when the violence out here on the frontier in Kansas begins, because people don't agree over this issue of popular sovereignty. But the Supreme Court will finally get its hands on this case. And they do it in 1857 in a case called Dred Scott versus Sanford. I'm not going to go into all the details of the case because it's pretty elaborate, and it ultimately doesn't bear a whole lot on what I gleaned from the case. But suffice it to say this: Dred Scott was a slave who had been carried into the North by his master, and he sued for freedom based on that. He said, my master, he took me into the North, into a free state, and lived there. I should be free. That's how the case should have been decided. But the man on the right, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, a man by the name of Roger B. Taney, who was a slaveholder, comes up with a very imaginative decision that ultimately he thinks will settle this popular sovereignty issue. He says, not only is Dred Scott not free, he's still a slave, but he's still a slave because the federal government has no right to say that this territory may be free, this territory may be slave. Only the people have the right to do that when they are drafting their Constitution and asking for admission into the Union as a state. He's endorsed the Southern position. The problem for the South is by 1857, it's a Pyrrhic victory. It doesn't mean anything. The country is basically in chaos by 1857 over this slavery issue. And the warfare over slavery in Kansas, the interminable discussion that had been going on since the 1840s, and as I argue, since even before then, had finally exploded into a full-blown dispute over the future of slavery, but also the future of the Union. Popular sovereignty never gets settled. They never decide how it's supposed to work, and the whole thing collapses under its own weight. And so this idea of popular sovereignty being a compromise solution, something that's supposed to unite the North and the South and try to quiet the differences between those who are pro-slavery and those who are anti-slavery, it actually exacerbates those differences. It makes them clearer, it brings them out in sharper relief, and it intensifies them. And that's ultimately, I think, you can look at popular sovereignty as a way of understanding how the nation descended into civil war. That's how I answered my question that I got started on up here in 2004. And ultimately, I wrote a dissertation on this, and I'm now trying to revise that into a book manuscript and getting that published. And that's one way of how something that started as a very small idea here, when I was finishing up my master's degree, ended up into something that's really probably taken far too much of my time and thought over the succeeding 6 years. But that's how I found my niche in the field of history. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any questions you have, but thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion, so please ask. Don't be shy. Chris, one thing that occurred to me as you were talking was that, you hear a lot in elementary school about slavery being the Civil War being fought over states' rights issues and not over slavery. I think that's obviously not an accurate way to put it, but the way you're describing it, it does seem like I mean, not that you can separate those two things out when you talk about the causes of the Civil War, but would you weight one more heavily than the other, this idea of popular sovereignty and states' rights? Versus
Well,
just like, you didn't say anything at all about the moral issue of slavery, and I know that has to play a part in there as well, so.
that's one of the interesting parts of the issue. I'll kind of divide that question in two if I can. I focus a lot more on the South in my research project here because I feel that most of these events turned on what the South was thinking. The South was trying to expand slavery, and the North, to a large degree and for a very long time, was trying to appease the South. The moral issue did not occur to the minds of most Southerners throughout the 19th century. There were some Southerners in the early part of the 19th century who said, yeah, slavery is an immoral institution, but you know what? The British brought it over. It's really their fault. You know, yeah. And we've got to live with it. You know, Thomas Jefferson said, well, it's like having a wolf by the ears.
Yeah.
Well, by the 1820s, after the Missouri Compromise, the South really undergoes a subtle change of opinion on that. The North gets very concerned with the moral issue. And that becomes one of the main consuming issues for Northerners, is they say, look, you know, holding another person as chattel property is immoral. It's wrong. And the Southerners begin to say, well, no, it's not. They say, no, slavery is, you can look at the Bible. You know, it's in the Bible. And they come up with very elaborate defenses of slavery based on that. And they say, you know, you want to know what's really immoral? They say the way the North is treating the South as an inferior partner in this enterprise of the American Republic, that's what's immoral. So they try to turn the question on its head, which is kind of absurd to a large degree. The other part of the issue, though, whether slavery or states' rights, that's a question that I think most historians love to dodge because it gets involved in, you know, if you say it's states' rights, then you get accused of being a Confederate apologist. The most compelling thing I have read, and what I believe is it's both, and you really can't divorce one from the other. States' rights really emerges in large part as a constitutional defense for the institution of slavery. And without it, without states' rights, Southerners believe slavery can't exist or it can't be perpetuated.